Hi, I'm Ted Diers, Administrator of the Watershed Management Bureau at the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services, DES. I'll be joined in this presentation by Gregg Comstock, who supervises our water quality planning section. Today, we will be discussing the Section 401 Water Quality Certification Program and recent federal changes to the process. Through this presentation, we will answer a number of questions such as, what is a 401 certification? Do I need one, and how do I get it? We will conclude with a few take-home points and allow time at the end for questions. We are not going to cover the 401 certifications for National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, NHDES permits, or surface water quality withdrawals. Those processes remain mostly unchanged. What is the 401 Water Quality Certification? The citation for the federal authority is Clean Water Act Section 401. And the federal regulations can be found at 40 CFR Part 121. This is the part that was recently revised and is commonly referred to as the final rule. In our state statutes, the authority for 401 certifications can be found at RSA 45 A12 Roman 3, which is the focus of today's discussion. We also have a state statute RSA 45 A12 Roman 4, which covers certifications for large surface water withdrawals or diversions. And we'll be happy to talk more about those at some other time. Let's break down the basics of the 401. The main purpose of Section 401 of the Clean Water Act is to ensure that certain federal activities, permits, projects, and such, comply with state water quality laws. A 401 certification is needed when the following three triggers are met. First, a federal license or permit is needed to conduct an activity, including, but not limited to, construction or operation. 2, the activity may result in a discharge. And 3, the discharge is to the waters of the United States. In such cases, the applicant must apply for a water quality certification from the certifying authority that the discharge complies with all applicable water quality requirements. There are three entities involved in this process. There is the project proponent, who is applying for a federal license or permit, the state, who is the certifying authority, and the federal licensing or permitting agency. Sometimes the federal agency is the applicant for things like general permits, but most of the time there is some other entity, such as a hydropower facility or a land developer, who is the project proponent. In New Hampshire, the DES Watershed Management Bureau is the certifying authority for 401s, except for those 401s for NHDES permits, which are handled by Wastewater Engineering Bureau. Again, the basic premise of 401 certification is to ensure that the activity requiring a federal license or permit will meet surface water quality standards. While there are a number of federal water quality requirements, we are focused on Section 303 of the Clean Water Act, which is the section that covers surface water quality criteria, the way most of us think about it. So what are surface water quality criteria? The state creates surface water quality standards which are approved by EPA. In New Hampshire, our standards are primarily located in Administrative Rules ENV WQ 1700 and in RSA 45 A8 and include three parts. The first is designated uses. That are those aspects of the water that we humans rely on, things like fishing and recreation. The second is water quality criteria to protect the designated uses. A good example is no less than 5 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen to protect aquatic life. And the last component of surface water quality standards is anti-degradation. The purpose of anti-deg is to keep our clean waters as clean as possible and not to make dirty waters dirtier. Now let's dive into the reason for this presentation today. The recent changes to the federal 401 certification rules found in 40 CFR Part 121 that are titled Clean Water Act Section 401 Certification Rule. The new rules, which are commonly called the final rule, went into effect on September 11th, 2020. The previous federal rules apply to any certification application submitted prior to that date. The new rules make a number of changes and clarifications. Here, what we suggest are the four biggest ones to note, and which we will talk about more later in our presentation. First, initiating certification. The final rule clarifies that certification is required for federally licensed or permitting activities that may result in a discharge from a point source or a potential point source into a water of the United States. 2, early engagement. The final rule promotes early engagement and coordination amongst project proponents, the state, and the federal licensing and permitting agencies. Also, requesting a pre-filing meeting is now required. The scope of the review. The final rule clarifies that the scope of the state's Section 401 certification review is limited to assuring that the discharge from a point source into a water of the United States resulting from a federally licensed or permitted activity will comply with water quality requirements as defined in the rule. And finally, timelines. The final rule clarifies that action on a certification request must be taken within a reasonable period of time, but in no case later than 1 year after the receipt of the certification request. We should note two really important caveats to our comments on the new rules. First, they are new. They are new to the feds, they're new to the state agencies, so we are all still figuring them out, and they are untested in the courts. Second, the new administration is reviewing the new rule and may elect to make changes, though that would take quite a while. The final rule clarifies that a discharge means a discharge from a point source to a water of the United States. The rule does not include a definition for point source, but the preamble for the final rule in the July 13th, 2020 Federal Register does. Point source discharges are discernible, confined, and discrete conveyances, as opposed to non-point source discharges, such as septic systems or overland sheet flow. It's also important to recognize that the point source discharge does not have to contain pollutants. The definition states from pollutants which are or may be discharged. Finally, point sources may also include equipment such as bulldozers and excavators and the like. We note that the 401 rules only apply to waters of the US, otherwise known as WOTUS. WOTUS is another new rule that is under review by the new administration. This WOTUS issue has not yet been raised in the context of 401 certifications in our state, but it is very complex, and for that reason, we're going to leave all this fine print for another day. Most of the final rule focuses on process rather than definitions. For the rest of this presentation, we will talk about the process in the context of permitting frameworks. As noted earlier, the whole process can take no more than 1 year once the application is complete. Depending on individual agency rules and procedures, the time frame may be less than a year for some permits. Gregg is now going to talk about each point on this timeline. For your convenience, we've included the parts of the federal rule that apply so you can reference them in the future from this presentation. Take it away, Gregg.
Thank you, Ted. Hello, everyone. To start the 401 certification process, the final rule requires project proponents to request a pre-filing meeting with DES at least 30 days prior to submitting a certification request. The meeting needs to be documented, so it's recommended that you would submit the meeting request in writing. The pre-filing meeting request provides DES with advance notification that a certification request is forthcoming. The final rule does not require DES to hold a meeting, but in most cases, we've always encouraged these meetings. Submitting a draft of the federally required certification request, which is shown as WQC request on the slides, and our standard DES certification application as soon as possible is an optional step that we highly encourage, as it will give us an early indication of the potential impacts your project may have on surface waters and could shorten the time it takes to process the certification. More on the difference between the two in a bit. Applicants must concurrently submit a written, signed, and dated certification request that satisfies the federal requirements in the regulations shown and submit the certification request in accordance with applicable DES submission procedures, which are on our water quality certification webpage. If any components are missing from the certification request, or if the request is not submitted in accordance with DES submission requirements, the statutory reasonable period of time for DES to act on the request does not start. Again, while not required by the final rule, we highly recommend that you also submit our DES certification application at the same time because, one, it calls for information that DES needs to process and review an application. Two, it likely includes parts that can be referenced in the certification request. And three, if not submitted, we will likely request it. As previously mentioned, filling out this application and submitting it as soon as possible will help speed up our technical review. This slide shows the list of certification requirements in the final rule. We're not going to dwell on this right now, but suffice it to say that it is really important that all of these prescriptive elements are addressed in the certification request. If they are not addressed, the certification request will be considered incomplete and review will not start. We therefore encourage you to carefully review section 121.5b of the final rule. Though not required, DES plans to let the project proponent know if we believe that the certification request satisfies the final rule and the data was received in accordance with our certification submission procedures. Similarly, if there are omissions or errors, DES plans to notify the project proponent and the federal agency. Here's the link to the DES Water Quality Certification webpage that includes the application and submittal guidance, as well as a number of other helpful documents. The guidance document outlined in red at the bottom of the slide includes our submission procedures. Once the certification request satisfies the federal requirements, we begin our technical review of the request. That analysis and finalization of the certification must be done within the reasonable period of time, or RPT, that is set by the applicable federal agency within 15 days of receiving a certification request. Minimum reasonable periods of time can vary by federal agency, such as 60 days for the Army Corps of Engineers and 1 year for FERC hydropower licenses. DES may request an extension of the reasonable period of time, but in no case can it extend beyond the 1-year limit. The reasonable period of time does not pause or stop for any reason, and DES cannot ask you to withdraw a request. A project proponent can, however, voluntarily withdraw a certification request during the reasonable period of time. However, if they do, DES no longer has an obligation to act on that certification request, and any resubmitted certification request initiates a new reasonable period of time. In our technical analysis, we will be focused on making sure point source discharges from the activity, which may discharge to waters of the U.S., including any associated pollutants in those discharges, do not result in violations of New Hampshire surface water quality standards. For projects that may disturb the land, most of the time we are focused on turbidity, total suspended solids, and nutrients. Sometimes that changes based on particulars of the discharge or if the downstream water is impaired for some other parameter. Finally, we must look at anti-degradation. This presentation isn't about anti-degradation. That is often one of the most challenging issues related to water quality certifications. One way to satisfy the anti-degradation review is to demonstrate that pre-project contaminant levels in the receiving waters will not increase after the project is constructed and operational. DES has developed guidance to assist with anti-degradation demonstrations, which is available on our water quality certification website. At the end of our analysis, DES will prepare a draft water quality certification. The draft water quality certification is then sent out for a minimum 30-day public comment period. There is no requirement for a hearing, but one can be requested. Once the comment period is over, DES prepares a response to the comments received and works to finalize the certification. There are 4 possible actions DES can take with regard to certification. They are grant certification with conditions, deny certification, or waive its opportunity to provide certification. If DES grants certification, it must be in writing and include a statement that the discharge will comply with water quality requirements. If certification is granted, the federal agency may proceed with issuing the license or permit. Normally, there are some conditions placed on water quality certifications. Under the new rules, if DES grants certification with conditions, each condition must include a citation to the federal or state law that authorizes the condition, and a statement explaining why the condition is necessary to assure that the discharge from the proposed project, or authorized under a general permit, will comply with water quality standards. If the federal agency denies a condition, it should give a reason why. If DES denies certification for an individual license or permit, we must include the following in the written denial: the specific water quality requirements with which the discharge will not comply, a statement explaining why the discharge will not comply with the identified water quality requirements, and if the denial is due to insufficient information, a description of the specific water quality data or information, if any, that would be needed to assure that the discharge from the proposed project will comply with water quality requirements. That last one is particularly important. In the past, if the project proponent had difficulty providing the required information, then the time frame for the decision could be extended to allow more time to collect the information. Given the time frame restrictions in the new rules, this is no longer possible, which emphasizes the need to meet with us as early as possible and to provide all the information we need to process the certification request as quickly as you can. DES can also waive its opportunity to provide its water quality certifications in two ways. First, the certification requirement for a federal license or permit will be waived if DES provides a written notification to the project proponent and the federal agency stating that it expressly waives its authority to act on a certification request. And second, the request is deemed waived if DES fails or refuses to act on it within the reasonable period of time. If DES refuses or fails to act, the federal agency must provide written notice to the administrator, DES, and the project proponent that waiver of the certification or specific certification conditions has occurred. In that case, the federal agency's written waiver notice satisfies the project proponent's requirement to obtain certification, and upon issuance of the waiver notice, the federal agency may issue the license or permit. With regards to enforcement, the final rule allows DES to inspect the facility or activity prior to initial operation. If we determine that the discharge will violate the certification conditions in the federal license or permit, DES has to notify the project proponent and federal agency in writing and recommend remedial measures to bring the certified project into compliance with the certification conditions in the federal license or permit. The final rule clarifies that the federal agency alone is responsible for enforcing certification conditions that are incorporated into a federal license or permit. This is a clarification of the previous federal regulations, which did not discuss the enforcement role of the federal agency. Section 401 of the Clean Water Act does not authorize DES to independently enforce a 401 certification or specific certification conditions in the federal license or permit. However, the final rule does not preclude states from pursuing enforcement actions that are authorized by state law and are not preempted by other federal statutory provisions. In closing, we'd like to leave you with a few take-home points. First, the certification request must meet all federal requirements for the clock to start, so pay close attention to that part of the rules. Second, request and attend a pre-application meeting or meetings if necessary, and communicate early and often. Also, provide all requested information as soon as possible to avoid DES having to deny the certification because information is lacking for us to make a determination. And finally, this is all new, which means there may be lawsuits to interpret the rule. In addition, the rule is under review by the new administration, which means it may change, or, in other words, the final rule may not be final. So stay tuned. This concludes our presentation. We'd like to thank everyone for attending this session, and NHDOT and ACEC New Hampshire for inviting us to present at this event. With that, we are happy to answer any questions.